Happy New Year! Let's say goodbye to the year 2023, a year of climate records, a year of massive forest fires and heat waves. Let's say hello to 2024 when global warming is going to get even worse. This is Professor Earth. Now, I wasn't surprised by how hot it got in 2023, but many climate scientists were. And there's one reason for that. The main organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the international organization designed to determine just how hot the planet's going to be, failed us. They've been engaging in greenwashing. They've been putting out numbers that are too low, and as the climate warms, people are surprised, but they shouldn't be. So why is this greenwashing going on, and what form is it taking? Well, let's look at this very closely. The International Panel on Climate Change, in their 2021 document, The Physical Science Basis of Climate Change, evaluated just how much CO2 we could still put out before we'd warm to 1.5 degrees C. And they told us that we had years to go before we'd reach this level. They seem to feel that the carbon budget is like a dandelion. We've blown some of it away, but more remains to be used up and blown away. Well, that isn't true. The entire idea that we have a carbon budget left that we can use up before we reach 1.5 degrees C is entirely false. You can find online clocks counting down how much carbon we have to use up. They're entirely wrong. This is a betrayal of science. It's based on false premises, false ideas, and it's highly misleading. So what is the IPCC doing that I'm using strong words like betrayal? Well, they're just denying the most basic facts about climate science. Something the IPCC knows very well is that there's a delay in the climate effect of putting CO2 in the atmosphere. Here's a very basic experiment done years ago, and it shows if you put a slug of CO2 into the atmosphere, it takes, say 10 years for that slug to equilibrate and for the temperature to reflect that amount of CO2. There's a time lag. And that early work by Caldera showing that there's a time lag before temperature increases has been reproduced over and over again. For instance, in the paper by Zickfield and Harrington in 2015, they did experiments with multiple doses of different sizes of CO2, and they found different time lags with bigger time lags for bigger doses of CO2, some time lags lasting decades or even hundreds of years. Here's another experiment with a very large dose of CO2, and the equilibrium temperature isn't reached for hundreds of years, so there's a very significant delay. And we see the same kind of lag if we look at real-world information from the paleo record. Here's a paper by Shackham and my old friend Peter Clark and others, and they looked at the real-world comparisons between paleoclimate records of warming and the ice core records of CO2 in the atmosphere. And they found warming in the atmosphere follows CO2 increases in the atmosphere by hundreds of years. It's as clear can be. So the finding of the IPCC that we have a carbon budget, that we can put out more carbon and not reach 1.5 degrees C warming, is misinformation. Well, the next obvious question is, if we don't have a carbon budget, then how warm is it actually going to get based on how much CO2 is in the atmosphere? So we have a record amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, as we can see. We're up over 420 parts per million, and we have no analog for that, and the models aren't working. What can we do? What we'd like to do is find some way if we could do an experiment on the Earth where we add CO2 to the amount that we have and see what the temperature becomes. And there's a way to do that, because in the past, CO2 has been at this level. So when is the last time that CO2 has been at 420 parts per million in the history of the Earth? Well, thanks to Barbel Honish and her group in the CO2 Project, who have reconstructed CO2 through the last 65 million years ago. They've done this using paleo proxy records. These are things that change in response to CO2 in the atmosphere. And when they collect all the data they can, they get a very complicated picture. But the most complete record of ancient CO2 comes from boron isotopes in foraminifera. Now, these are very small little shells that form in the ocean, and the amount of boron isotope responds to the amount of CO2 dissolved in the seawater. That's a function of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this gives a good proxy record of atmospheric carbon dioxide variations through ancient times, And the last time CO2 was at the same level it is today was in the middle Miocene, 14 million years ago. Look at the red line on the right-hand side of this plot. That's ancient CO2 levels, and you can see that about 14 million years ago, it was over 420, 430, 440, which is where we are with modern CO2 levels in our modern atmosphere. And 14 million years ago was unusually warm because we were having almost 5,000 cubic kilometers of basalt erupted in the Columbia River basalts, and this was putting much CO2 into the atmosphere. So really, it's a perfect fit to what we see now. We've got human CO2 in the atmosphere now, and we had natural volcanic CO2 then, but they reached the same level, so they should have the same amount of warming. And how much warming did the Earth have the last time atmospheric CO2 hit 420, 430 parts per million? Well, let's go to the mid-Miocene climatic optimum. At that time, the Earth was about 8 degrees C warmer than present. So that's what we're looking at. The Earth has done this experiment before. When the Earth has climate forcing from 420 above parts per million, it's going to warm by 8 degrees C. Now, there's a climate lag to get there. It might take us hundreds of years to get there, but that's what's going to happen with the amount of CO2 we have now. So this is a completely different result than the IPCC generated, where they said we have a climate budget remaining and we could put more CO2 in the atmosphere without even reaching 1.5 or 2 degrees C. I submit that this is misinformation from the IPCC, that we already have too much CO2 in the atmosphere. And in fact, it's dangerous misinformation because we need to start reducing CO2 now, not after some imaginary CO2 budget is expended. Okay, Happy New Year! Happy New Year and have a wonderful 2024.